Thank you, Scott. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I must say I'm absolutely flattered to be here, delighted by the same measure. I'm going to try and share some personal experiences of my journey as an entrepreneur. But as Scott pointed out, I think we're all entrepreneurs at heart. I mean, there was a recent study done among the Russell 12 universities in the UK, and they asked the students there, what percentage of you want to be an entrepreneur? Well, the answer was actually 65%, which in itself is quite incredible when you consider there are more people working in multinationals and corporates today than ever before. I think, entrepreneurialism, entre is a shared word, and yet it's tended to be considered as a very personal thing. Obviously, I couldn't resist the opportunity of sharing this celebratory moment. I'm sure you'll remember the 23rd of October last year. As an Englishman, the only satisfaction we could take is that 15 million French people got up that morning only to see their side lose. But no, in reality, talking about entrepreneurship and innovation, I mean, I guess every company in the world aspires to be innovative. And if you look at the two most valuable companies in the world today, as measured by brand value, those two are Apple and Google. Google actually had the honor in 2010, but it's been eclipsed by Apple. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the corporates that I've worked for and how that really encouraged me to become an entrepreneur. And as I say, I think when I take you through the journey, you'll see there is a connection with New Zealand, because at this point I have two confessions to make. The first is that this is actually my first ever visit to New Zealand. I was stopped at border control with 40 cases of Marmite, but they wouldn't let me through. So I was trying to, further engender myself to you this morning. But no, not only is that my first confession, my second one, and I probably better put my hand over the microphone, is that I married an Australian. She's actually in the audience here today. But there was an Olympic connection, because we actually met at the Sydney 2000 Games in September 2000. No, I wasn't competing. But in reality, there is a connection through my life with sport, and I think all of us, probably the moments, the memories of our lives are punctuated with major sporting achievements of family or friends, but also of the teams and the sporting idols that we follow. So a little bit about me. That's me in typical sporting pose, sitting down. I can't profess to be a particularly successful sportsman in my own right, but as I say, my career actually started working for one of the most innovative advertising agencies in the world, Saatchi & Saatchi. When I joined, they were the world's leading advertising agency. Of course, they're no longer. But in reality, Saatchi's were pushing the boundaries and were provoking the advertising industry, taking on the stalwarts like J. Walter Thompson and Leo Burnett and Ogilvy and Mather. So I was fortunate enough to actually work in Charlotte Street, the headquarters of Saatchi's, and not only were Charles and Morris regular lift companions as they went to the 6th floor, I was on the 4th floor, but one, Martin Sorrell, who I would often do work for, along with John Perris, who was the worldwide media director. And what I learnt was a work ethic at Saatchi's, and it was pretty much my first foot in the door came through what I would say is a slightly innovative approach, which was offering to work for free. Now, of course, internships are all the rage nowadays, much to the chagrin of the poor souls that have to undertake the internship gratis. But in reality, I think that's a very important measure, is to be prepared to go that extra mile and to, in my case, to work for free. I soon realized 3 years later that working for a de minimis salary at Saatchi's wasn't the best way forward. So I was motivated to move into the city. The Big Bang had happened in 1986. Banks were acquiring traditional stockbroking firms. And so I went to work for, in the first year in 1986, CIBC, Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. And I was lucky enough to work for the leading publishing analyst, a gentleman called Eric de Belague, and I worked there for a year, and soon after I was fortunate enough to take advantage of the listing of a business called Capital Radio, and I followed that through with a recruitment offer from Citibank. So I joined Citibank, and there I spent 3 years and became the top-rated media analyst in the UK. And it was this constant thirst for knowledge. I'd always remembered the idiom that knowledge is power, and I was fascinated with everything to do with the media industry, but of course still had a burning passion for sports, and was recognizing the role that sports could play in the media industry. In 1991, I moved to Swiss Bank Corporation, now part of UBS, and there I worked in corporate finance and mergers and acquisitions. That working for these major brands, as I say, working for CIBC, Citibank, Swiss Bank, it was very exciting, but nonetheless, I was very keen to see if I could pursue a career, and I was fortunate enough to work with clients that were, in many respects, prepared to back me. So in 1995, I took a number of clients, including Adidas, Robert Louis Dreyfus, gave me a mandate, Ted Turner, Capital Cities ABC, Disney, United News and Media. So these companies were prepared to back me as an individual because they saw that I had perhaps some insights into sport and the way in which sport was going to impact the media business. So I was lucky enough to be retained by them. Having advised the FA Premier League, which was formed in 1992 whilst at Swiss Bank, Sir John Quinton and Rick Parry, who were chairman and chief exec at the time, I basically recognised that the formation of the Premier League was a golden opportunity for the 22 formative members of the Premier League to actually create their own channel. So there were 3 bidders at the time. There was ITV, the incumbent, led by Greg Dyke. There was Sky, run by Sam Chisholm and Gary Davey, obviously with the backing of Rupert Murdoch. And there was my consortium, which was comprised of Thames Television, with backing from Swiss Bank. And we were looking to create a dedicated soccer channel, which would have given the majority ownership to the football clubs, and we would have effectively leased space on the Astra satellite and launched what would have been the first thematic sports channel in a pay environment anywhere in the world. However, obviously the offer that was made by BSkyB and BBC was too tempting for the Premier League clubs. And so I decided in 1995-1996, when I was working with Adidas and United News and Media and Ted Turner and Richemont, Johan Rupert, I said, we need to wrest away control from from Sky of the Premier League rights. So we put together a consortium and we bid £1.4 billion in June 1996. However, Sky were given a matching right, and they succeeded with a bid of $674 million over a 4-year period. So at that point, I said, well, let's activate Plan B, which is to buy sufficient number of Premier League clubs. At that point, 7 would have been a blocking minority, a blocking 1/3 minority of the then 20 Premiership clubs which existed. And I said, that way we can stop Rupert Murdoch in his tracks. Anyway, so I'd lined up the acquisition of the 7 requisite clubs, including Leeds United, at which point the various heads of the companies, the protagonists, decided that they didn't have the stomach to actually buy into a football club. I, at this point, had already committed myself, so in August 1996, acquired Leeds United in a £30 million transaction. Now, the point of that story is that I had recognised how big sport was likely to be and a key driver of the subscription pay market in the UK, as had, in fairness, the media companies that I was advising, but in reality, they didn't appreciate how they could have effectively had a stranglehold through a consortium approach by directly owning the clubs. As we know later, Rupert Murdoch tried to acquire Manchester United and was rebuffed through the Monopolies Mergers Commission. I went ahead, as I said, I bought Leeds United in 1996, and very soon I became attached to the club. It's very hard to be dispassionate about sport, but I wasn't a Leeds United fan at heart, and I think a lot of the problems that are confronted with sports owners today is that they forget all the work that they've done creating their fortunes, and they effectively become hobbyists or investors purely through passion, and sometimes to the detriment of the club. So in my case, I was trying to be dispassionate, and I was trying to build a multi-sports franchise. I'd obviously followed the Madison Square Garden example and seen how regional sports networks have become so prevalent in the States. So for me, there was an opportunity to create a stadium and arena, effectively a hybrid of multi-sports and entertainment, so the sportainment that Scott was referring to earlier. So in essence, that was the journey I began. I managed to secure unprecedented planning permission from the Leeds City Council. I basically threatened to move Leeds United to Wakefield if they didn't agree, so that sort of helped. And they were prepared to grant me 50-acre plot to develop the indoor arena, 15,000-seat arena, and ancillary leisure development to support that. But something happened. It was pretty much the evolution of the internet. So in early 1997, I was approached by a gentleman called Peter Wilkinson, who was then running a business called Planet Online, which was a business-to-business ISP. And he said, I'm a Leeds fan, and I'd like to launch internet for the club. So that's my best Yorkshire accent. So I said, well, certainly, Peter, you have the credentials. You're one of the most successful IT entrepreneurs in the UK. So sure enough, he launched Planet Football with Paul Sykes of Meadowhall fame. It was a £2 company. Within a year, he said, I've had an approach from Kelvin McKenzie of Mirror Group, wants to buy Planet Football. What do you think? I said, well, actually, I'd like to buy it, Peter. He says, you haven't got any money. What are you going to buy it with? I said, well, I'll create a shell, I'll list it on the market, and I'll give you some paper. Some paper? I can't spend that in Morrison's. I want cash. So I said, well, if you're actually prepared to wait, Peter, there's an opportunity to scale this business, because by this point, late 1997, early 1998, we could all recognize that the internet was fast taking off as a global phenomenon, and people hadn't really calculated just what that would mean in the sports industry. So for me, I was determined to demonstrate to Peter that I could actually buy the asset from him. So I was conflicted. I obviously had the chairman CEO role of Leeds United Football Club, but I also could see that the internet was going to be quite an extraordinary opportunity, especially in the sports market. So what happened is I resigned in September 1998 from Leeds, and I created a shell company, which literally with an initial share capital I put in £25,000, and then I decided I'd raise some more money from friends and family. So by March of 1999, I put together a pool of about £2.5 million of capital. I put some more money in. I think I was probably in for about £250,000 at the time of the flotation. So at this point, I had a listed shell, and when I wrote the prospectus, all that effectively said was it was intending to acquire sports content-related businesses, because at that point I hadn't done a deal with Peter. So I ring up Peter and say, right, I've got a listed vehicle, and because of my track record, and this is where obviously market conditions allowed at that time, we'd enjoyed a spectacular increase in the share price. So I think day one we had a 500% premium. Everything was going mad in the internet world. So having floated at 25 pence, within a month I think we were trading at about £4 a share, and I had a market capitalisation of something like 50–60 million pounds. Bearing in mind that there was only £2 million of cash in there, clearly was a lot of goodwill. So I said to Peter, I said, look, I've got this company now, I'd like to buy Planet Football. Planet Football at that point had secured 12 of the 20 Premiership exclusive websites. So Peter was obviously feeling confident. Kelvin McKenzie had offered him £13 million. I had a stratospheric share price and a lot of paper. But anyway, after many discussion and debate, he finally resolved that he would sell me Planet Football. Bear in mind, he'd only set it up for £2. So in June of 1999, that's correct, I agreed a deal, and we paid £24 million, all in paper, for Planet Football. As I say, at this point, that suddenly put us on the radar of the two big players in the media industry in the UK, which was B-Sky B and NTL. And it was at that point that we started to create, in the very formative months of life post-Planet Football, started to create an auction environment. So what I then realized is that sports content was one key thing. We could all see that content was a key component, but I realized that statistics, sport and statistics are inextricably linked. So in July of 1999, I bought a company called Opta, and Opta was the market leader in the field of statistical information for not only the Premier League, but the Football League, the Scottish Premier League, and effectively that then gave us a major position, the combination of the content and the statistics. Rapidly moving forward, the final element of the business was betting. Now, sports betting obviously has become a multi-billion-dollar industry, but back then it was dominated by the traditional high street bookmakers, the TABs and equivalent. So I decided that I would buy a business that had an offshore license, that had telephone betting, but effectively it would be a way of exploiting club-related betting. Bearing in mind that we had the 12 of the 20 Premiership clubs under our control, we were able to effectively white label a betting solution for those clubs. So by December of 1999, finishing the story, the calls came in from B-Sky-B. And as I say, after a heart-stopping moment when anything that Murdoch touched tended to get referred to the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, thankfully, because of the stratospheric price he was paying, they let that one through. But in reality, that business, the Sports Internet Group business, is better known as Sky Bet today. Sky Bet last year contributed about £44 million of operating profit to the B-Sky-B business. So one could say I should have held on to that, but needless to say, as Scott's alluded to, I'm a fairly plural individual, so the temptations of setting up my own business were too great. And one of my boyhood heroes was Mark McCormack, who, obviously, God rest his soul, invented the sports marketing industry as we know it over 50 years ago now. And of course, in my time at Saatchi's, I'd learnt from Martin Sorrell, he'd actually spent some time working at IMG as well. So I think IMG, Mark McCormack, and advertising, those in my teenage years were the most impressionable aspects of my life. So that's enough on me, but let's come back to a New Zealand connection, because actually there is a sportsman in my family. I have 4 elder brothers and an elder sister. I'm the youngest of 6, probably explains a lot. So my brother, Nick Akers, he was a pretty accomplished amateur athlete, and I remember watching him at sports days. He's 7 years older than me, but I remember going to sports days, and he, at the age of 13, would be beating 18-year-olds, and that was quite freaky. Bear in mind, we came from Sussex, a fairly geriatric part of the UK, but he had an absolute passion. I would go cycling, and he would beat me running, and I thought, what is it? What's driving him? And basically, what drove him is an absolute desire to become an Olympian. Obviously, we have some Olympians, many Olympians in the room here, but he quite simply wasn't good enough to qualify for England or the UK. He did run at the Phoenix Club in Brighton with Steve Ovett, and they became quite good friends, but obviously Steve was head and shoulders above him in performance terms. So what he decided to do was he thought, well, where's the best place in the world for a middle long-distance runner to live and train? Well, where else other than New Zealand? Obviously, the fabled success of Peter Snell and Rod Dixon and Dick Quacks and Johnny Walker were legendary, so he decided that he would come to New Zealand. And Nick, being ever the entrepreneur, decided that he would ring up the Guinness Book of World Records and he'd speak to Norris McGuirk and say, I'm going to set a new world record in New Zealand. I said, what on earth are you going to do? He says, I'm going to be the first person to walk/jog around North Island non-stop. I said, oh, okay. So, needless to say, the late Robert Muldoon, who subsequently became Prime Minister in 1975, met him at Auckland Airport back in 1973. And there were old photographs of that occasion. Nick mysteriously got some sort of thigh injury, so was unable to pursue that particular commitment. Anyway, Nick moved to Dunedin, and he did actually, this is, I don't know if you can see the certificate, but in Invercargill, he actually won the junior men's 1,500 metres in a time of, I think, 4 minutes and 26 seconds. He did get a time down to 4 minutes and 9 seconds, but again, nothing to threaten his inclusion in the New Zealand team. You can see, maybe make out there, the Ariki, if I pronounce that correctly. Now, earlier today, we had a picture of the legendary Dick Taylor, who, of course, is the most famous ever Ariki Club member. So there was a connection there. So obviously, after the success of his 10,000 metre gold medal in Christchurch in 1974, Nick was looking forward to the 1978 Commonwealth Games, but sadly not for England or New Zealand, because he simply wasn't good enough, as I said. So what did he decide to do? Well, he thought he'd pack his bags and head somewhere where he might be able to compete. So he went on holiday literally on holiday to the Cayman Islands, famously known as a tax haven, and obviously a former sort of British protectorate. And he met the Minister of Youth and Sport and Tourism, a chap called Joel Bon. And in the 10 days, 2 weeks that he was there, he persuaded him that Cayman Islands should make their first ever entry into the Commonwealth Games. They'd never been to the Commonwealth Games before. Bear in mind, from an infrastructure perspective, unlike the Mayor's suggestion of $200 million worth of infrastructure, Cayman Islands had nothing. They had nice beaches, and still do, but they didn't have anything in the way of sporting infrastructure. So Nick decided that he would be the team captain. But there was a condition. The Minister of Youth and Sport, Joel Bond, said, only if my 16-year-old son gets to compete. He said, right, okay. And we got two fellows who fancy themselves in boxing. He said, okay, yeah. Well, I can't prejudge it because, you know, having got New Zealand citizenship, I forgot to add, he actually got fast-tracked into Cayman Island citizenship. Clearly, it's a different market there. So, in essence, we fast-forward to Edmonton 1978, and Her Majesty the Queen, you can probably just make out there on the podium, and you can see at the back of the line there is my brother, preceded by the three Cayman Islands entrants. Now, the other gentleman in the first sort of platoon is none other than Ian Woolridge. How many of you here have heard of Ian Woolridge? He was probably one of the most acclaimed sports writers, wrote for the Daily Mail. So what did my brother do, ever the entrepreneur? He realized that Cayman Islands weren't going to threaten much in the medals table, so he decided that he would invite, and this is unprecedented, he would invite Ian Woolridge to become part of the Cayman Islands team. And that led to the first and only time that a journalist has been part of an official march past. So, as I say, less of Nick's prowess in the 1,500, 5,000, 10,000 metres, other than recognising the power of television, as Brendan Foster, who won the gold medal in the 10,000, was passing the tape to win his gold medal. My brother turned to the camera, smiled and waved, because he knew we'd be watching back home in London. As I say, he'd just been lapped for the fourth time in the 10,000. Okay, now that might sound somewhat indulgent to talk about my brother, but let's look at other examples, and there are a myriad of examples of athletes who, either for political reasons or, dare I say it, financial reasons, but also performance reasons, have decided to change their national identity. I think you can probably recall, back to the Daily Mail, they played a major part in bringing Zola Budd over from South Africa to run for England. There she is barefooted, just about to trip up Mary Decker, in the 1984 Olympics. If you then look at Stephen Cherona, and I won't try and pronounce his new Islamic name, Saif Saeed Shaheen, obviously the world 3,000 metre hurdling champion and steeplechase champion, and he, in common with many other leading Kenyan athletes, effectively transferred their identity to Qatar. Now, it's been frowned upon, and it does happen, and it will continue to happen, but this is a further example of how money plays a part in sport, particularly when it comes to winning medals. Obviously, your New Zealand team had its greatest ever success in the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, and I've read that there are hopes of getting 10 or more medals. But in reality, the price of success and the glory associated with it is obviously encouraging people to use every means possible to secure the best possible talent, which is why we come on to Ricky Flutie, because England, quite candidly, we'd be delighted to have as many people as Graham and Steve would like to throw at us. You know, we're a glad recipient of any former or wannabe All Blacks, I should say. And as I say, in Ricky's case, don't you love the wallaby on the ground there? Anyway, in Ricky's case, it was very much a situation where he realised that it wouldn't be possible for him to get through normal grounds of parents or grandparents, but again, he was able to get through citizenship a position in the UK, and obviously has had great success. I was going to put up one other person, which was perhaps more pertinent in some respects of trading national identity, and that of Russell Coutts. Now, obviously, there's a gentleman who has succeeded at the highest level in the America's Cup with Team New Zealand, and then found that well-known yachting nation Switzerland to ply his trade with equal success, if not controversy as well. So some examples of how my brother, perhaps in his own little way, was setting a precedent for that. So moving on, 1980. Well, we all know that New Zealand sent a 4-person team because of the US boycott to the 1980 Olympics. So what were Cayman Islands going to do? Well, my brother recognized that it's actually quite an expensive business to continue to train and run in between jobs. So he was looking for some form of sponsorship, some form of endorsement without incurring the wrath of the IOC and the amateurism rules. So what he decided to do was that he would ring around sponsors and elect to change his surname by deed poll in lieu of sponsorship. So he rang up big brands like Nike, but Phil Knight had never heard of him. He rang up Smirnoff, but that was a no from them. He even rang up the Kellogg company. In the end, he found a vodka company based in Warrington by the name of Vladivar. You can see him sat on a crate of boxes there. So in March 1980, he became the first person ever in sporting history to change his name from Nick Akers to, in this case, Nick Vladivar. Now, Vladivar obviously sounds Russian. It doesn't mean anything. As I say, it's from Warrington in northwest England, but it captured an awful lot of publicity. Now, you'll like John's cartoon from the Daily Mail because it says there, in lane 1, Nick Vladivar, 2, Johnny Walker, 3, Mick Martini, Sid Schweppes, Dan Dubonnet. So, apocryphal as it is, there was this great amount of interest being shown in Nick. And I doubt people outside of the gold medalists would have had anything like the coverage that my brother secured. And the point of this story was to just effectively show the innovation and the entrepreneurialism to try and raise capital. And this is an issue that's confronting the long tail of sportsmen and women around the world. So, what price Tiger Woods? Interestingly, I had the good fortune at St Andrews in July 2000. Tiger had just won his 3rd major, the US Open that year. And I had dinner with Lee Westwood, Darren Clark, Chubby Chandler, their manager. I ended up buying his business a few months later. And Butch Harmon, who was then the fabled coach of Tiger Woods, who burst onto the scene in 1996 and clearly was the wonder kid of golf. Interestingly, when we were discussing our various businesses and history over dinner, I couldn't help but bring up my brother's experience. So I put it to Butch. I said, well, why wouldn't Mark Steinberg, Tiger's agent, and IMG consider approaching Nike? And maybe Tiger might consider changing his name from Woods to Nike. Anyway, rather than fall about laughing, Butch thought it was a fabulous idea. He really loved it. And he said, yeah, I promise you I'm going to talk to Mark Steinberg, who I didn't know, I only knew by name. Yeah, let me put it to Tiger. Now, bear in mind that until Tiger burst onto the scene, Nike had no presence in golf whatsoever. 0 revenue contribution. They signed Tiger up to a long-term deal, effectively giving him a 5% royalty. It's now a $1 billion golf business. And of course, at the time of Tiger's extracurricular activity, they were one of the few major sponsors that stood by him. So the point of the story was that there I was, had dinner, convinced that I was going to get in with the world's probably greatest, or soon to become greatest living sportsman and the first dollar billionaire in sports, only for then Tiger to win the British Open during the course of that week. He won by 8 shots over Thomas Bjorn. He then went on his Tiger Slam. So effectively having won the US Open and then the British Open, his first British Open, he then went on to win the PGA Championship and the Masters the following year in 2001. So at that point, Tiger held all 4 major trophies. So I think in the melee of all of his success, my idea didn't really progress. Anyway, the other juxtaposition here I put is Jeremy Lin. Now, who hasn't heard of Jeremy Lin in the room? Well, it's extraordinary because he burst onto the scene as recently as February of this year. Now, the Linsation, the Linsanity that we created was done in such a short time frame, largely as a consequence of social media. I mean, you all know the story, being passed over by 2 NBA teams, could barely get a place in the Knicks as point guard, and then lo and behold, through injuries and suspensions, he gets his big break, and effectively sets a record, sets a points record and assist record in the first 5 games that he played for the Knicks, and turned their season around. So the Linsanity then led to another war. Was he Chinese or was he Taiwanese? Now, of course, his parents are Taiwanese and they emigrated to the States. But, oh no, the Chinese wanted a piece of the action. And why would you blame them? Because what you have to remember is that in China, basketball is the #1 participant sport. Over 300 million people play basketball. Now, the last figures from FIFA said there are 265 million people that play football, that are registered football players. So actually more people in China play basketball than are registered footballers in the whole world. And that's largely a function of space constraint, the one-child policy, but also it's because in 1987 the NBA had the foresight to give their signal free of charge to CCTV, China Central Television. So from 1987 onwards, the Chinese population started to sample and experience basketball. Needless to say, there was a certain Great Wall of China, Yao Ming, who also assisted in the development of basketball. After his major feature in the Sydney Olympics in 2000, he was the first draft pick for the Houston Rockets in 2002, and then had a glorious 8-year career. But interestingly, the first match he ever played when playing for the Houston Rockets against Shaq O'Neal of the Los Angeles Lakers, 200 million Chinese live watched his first game. So what I'm saying is that you get a situation, and again, sort of analogous situation here with the Linsanity that's been created, is sport probably touches as a genre more than anything else, and the speed now, courtesy of technology and social media, the impact that it can have. Interestingly, the first people to actually sign up Jeremy Lin from a personal endorsement perspective were Volvo, which sadly no longer Swedish, it's part of the Chinese Geely Empire. So Volvo signed him up, and Taiwan's Acer Computers quickly followed up with a deal with the Knicks. So, as I say, whether or not these individuals need to change their surname for sponsorship remains to be seen, but there are examples, particularly in Thailand. Many of the Thai boxers have changed their names to everything from restaurants, gyms, car battery companies, you name it. That's happening all the time. So I think that will be a trend which becomes more prevalent in the year. Just to finish off on Nick, okay, so what happened to Nick after, unfortunately, Cayman similarly boycotted the 1980 Olympics, so he never got there. He changed his name back because obviously the £10,000 of sponsorship didn't last very long. So he changed his name back from Vladimir to Akers. And yes, he competed in the Brisbane 1982 Commonwealth Games. He competed in the 10,000 metres and the marathon, and he came last. But he was absolutely determined. In the same way in 1973, when he'd been greeted by Robert Muldoon, he was absolutely determined he was going to get into the Guinness Book of World Records. And I think this is really, again, further indicative of athletes who clearly aren't necessarily gifted or capable of winning medals, is to keep trying and to fulfill the goals and dreams. And so he basically, avid reader of the Guinness Book of World Records, he poured through it night after night until he could find one that he was confident that he could break. And lo and behold, he found snowshoeing. Having moved to Edmonton after the 1978 Commonwealth Games, God-forsaken place, but he decided to live there and still lives there today. And obviously they have some of the most inclement weather on the planet, and snow is a prerequisite to snowshoeing, of course. So he decided that he would attempt to break the then world record, which stood at about 7.5 minutes, which he duly did. And there you can see the official Guinness Book of Records certificate. And he smashed the record and did it in time of under 6 minutes, which is not to be scoffed at. I can't even run sub 6 minutes for that distance, a mile myself. So I think it's reflective, a little anecdotal story, but I thought I'd just share that with you this morning. So moving on from my brother to the embodiment of evil. No, moving on to Rupert Murdoch. I did mention in 1992 I had the pleasure of dealing with News Corporation in the guise of Sam Chisholm, a Kiwi, of course. And Sam taught me a very important lesson. He said, a general never lost a battle through good reconnaissance, which was basically shorthand for saying, I'm going to nick all the work you and Thames Television had done, and me being as naive as I was, thinking I could form a partnership with Sky. All I did with all my NOP and Mori research and other thoughts on the launch of a dedicated football channel was, I'd like to think, encourage him and Gary Davey to tell Digger that this was something they had to double down on. And so sure enough, for the first time in the history of football, live exclusive football transferred from free-to-air television, which had been held by the cosy duopoly of BBC and ITV, to Sky in August 1992. And they paid £214 million over 5 years, which was topped up with a further £14 million a year from the BBC for the highlights to mitigate any concerns that the national sport was being taken off television. Now, interestingly, what had encouraged Murdoch to do that was in 1987, he had tried to secure the AFC rights of the NFL, but had been thwarted. Second time round, he was more successful and paid $1.58 billion for those rights for Fox Television. So I think it's fair to say that it wasn't just Bart Simpson, but it was the NFL rights, which obviously helped develop the ratings for Fox. But obviously, the success that Sky has had over the last 20 years with the Premier League has made the Premier League the most successful international sporting franchise or series in the world today. The last international television rights deal was worth over £1 billion. The first international television deal was worth barely £3 million. So you can see a phenomenal increase, and that's largely because of the money that's been injected into the game and the number of international stars that are playing in that league. I don't want to dwell upon football exclusively today, but it's unquestionably, from a global perspective, the key sport. So a potted history on Sky in those 20 years. I mean, in fact, Sky Sport launched in 1990 in this country, and Sky Sports launched a year later. And it, since that time, has obviously had a number of milestones. Most recently, of course, with the advent of HD technology. HD was launched in October 2010. We've seen how Sky has effectively used technology to effectively advance the sports proposition. And it's been critical in terms of subscriber take-up and retention levels. And of course, it's created, in much the same way Sky Television here has, a virtual monopoly of sports. I think it's important to point out that Sky Sports is not exclusively about football, rugby, cricket, golf, etc. It actually, half of its output last year was devoted to schools athletics, women's sport, angling. So the minority sports are actually getting a window now, courtesy of digital television, which would never have been possible before. Also, because of the incredible profits that Sky are making, it's able to subsidise or take on those sports. So just to pick up on what Barney Francis, the MD, has said here, our desire to innovate has driven Sky Sports in the past as the key to a successful future. I'd like to say new technology and what use we make of it had a big influence on how people watch sports. So I think, unquestionably, the most exciting thing about the era we live in today is the advent of new technology. Now, just a quick straw poll here. I mean, obviously this device, not the latest i4S, but the i4, the iPhone was actually launched in June 2007. Now, between Apple and Samsung, if people raise their hands in the room, who has either an Apple iPhone or a Samsung Galaxy or an equivalent Android smartphone? There we go. So there are 6 billion mobile connections in the world, according to the ITU, and 20% or 1.2 billion people actually have a 3G phone. Now, 45% of the world is available for 3G reception. But it's interesting how smartphones, particularly in the OECD countries, there are 11 countries which have penetration of 40% or more of smartphones. And I would hazard that by 2015, in those OECD countries, 75% plus of people will have a smartphone. So this obviously has had a major bearing on the way in which sport has been consumed. But I think more so is this device. Now, how many people in the room have an iPad or equivalent tablet? There we go. So it wasn't until April 2010 until Apple launched their first iPad, onto the market. And obviously now as the latest version, the new iPad, not iPad 3, has come to market in March of this year, I think it's again making it really, these devices and the mobility associated with them is further stimulating the out-of-home experience. Now, not to the detriment of linear television. Linear television and catch-up television are still going to be very much a living room experience, particularly with HD, or in the case of Sky, they had the first ever Masters coverage exclusively in 3D this April, as Bubba Watson won in the playoff. So that was another first for Sky. So unquestionably, with the likes of Samsung and others introducing 55, 60, 75-inch smart screens and connected televisions into the home, they will remain, in my opinion, predominant. However, these new devices, unquestionably, are what are encouraging the second screen marketplace that we're living with today. So Sky Go, which is an evolution, effectively, from Sky Anytime, has obviously proven to be a perfect complement to the offerings that Sky have had. And the next development that's going to happen is going to be the launch of over-the-top television services. I mean, I take my iPad all over the world, and through VPN I'm able to have an IP address which dedicates to whichever country I would like it to. So obviously in my case the UK, so I can continue to watch the sports if I can't get them on that particular network. I mean, for example, when I came into Auckland the other night, I thought I would try and become a subscriber to Sky Television here. Obviously that wasn't possible without committing to a long-term contract. And I think what you have to remember is that in the UK, that of the 23 million television homes, there are 10 million who are Sky subscribers, but that means there are 13 million who aren't. And the prime reason that those 13 million haven't taken up is because they can satisfy themselves either through an out-of-home experience, whether it's a pub, a club, or someone else's house, or because they don't want to commit to a long-term contract. So I think the advent of over-the-top services is that it's going to provide much more an ad hoc experience, akin to pay-per-view as we know it. So in the same way your arena channel will show boxing or other pay-per-view style sporting and music events, effectively what Sky have recognized is that they need to now try and further broaden their penetration. And Sky Go is precisely a way of doing that. Interestingly, two of the telco networks, Orange and O2, now allow customers to pay just £5.99 a month to get what would typically cost £22 if you were to subscribe through the classic platform on Sky. So I think this is a combination of showing how technology, obviously when married with sport, and what it's provided. And I have to say, New Zealand is top class in terms of the proposition. I know people berate the fact that TVNZ and Sky Television effectively have a duopoly here, but I think the multiple coverage is evidence with the upcoming Olympics will show, that there's no denying that sport is still the battering ram, as Rupert Murdoch said, of driving content and driving new initiatives and development. Now, we can't fail to recognize the impact of the social media. Now, interestingly, in Michael's speech, he pointed out what was happening back in 2000 when the likes of Zuckerberg and Page and Brin and so on were either still at university or just left. Interestingly, when looking at this development, it's worth pointing out that YouTube, which was the pioneer of the modern day companies, was actually only created in 2005. And it was in November 2006 that Google at the time paid what was considered to be a preposterous sum of money, $1.65 billion, to buy YouTube, which at that point just had 20 million followers and no revenue model. There's entrepreneurialism, but also with the benefit of clearly some capital behind them. So looking at this page, I think it just encapsulates not only the move from, as I say, traditional phone and PC through to obviously tablets and smart televisions and connected televisions, but also the relationship, the growing relationship, the symbiotic relationship between the social media, technology and the sport. Sky's recognised that if it can't develop the capability in-house, then it needs to do what it can to be part of this bandwagon. And to that extent, earlier this year, it bought into a company called Zbox. And Zbox is effectively a social media service which allows people to comment on programs as they're watching them. Now, recent studies have shown from the States that 75% of all television viewing now takes place with a second screen. And sports, obviously, is potentially even higher than that. So people who are using Facebook or Twitter or Flickr or Zbox, these devices are starting to have a major bearing on stimulating people to come and watch television. So they're actually complementary rather than competitive to television. I mean, who here watched the marathon near 5-hour Australian Open tennis between Nadal and Djokovic? Okay. Well, the advantage of social media is that for people who necessarily weren't avid tennis followers, they couldn't help but be bewildered by this mesmerizing game. So 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hours into the marathon final, people on social media were encouraging their friends and their connections to watch this match. And I think that's further evidence of how social media can actually complement traditional sports television as we know it. And I think that's really evidential, and it will continue in that theme. Now, we've spoken about one octogenarian. Well, there were 7 that did the Rotorua Marathon, but obviously I don't think Rupert is up for marathons at the moment, not unless they're sort of Leveson Inquiry related. So moving on to another fabled entrepreneur, and if I've given Rupert Murdoch the accolade of being the world's leading, and I think he is unquestionably the world's leading media entrepreneur, then I think it's only fair that we sort of pay homage to Mr. E, Bernie, as being probably the world's most astute sports entrepreneur. I was very flattered because in the 2002 Sports Industry Awards, I was up against Bernie Ecclestone and Alan Pascoe, and clearly the vote rigging, no, clearly I was lucky enough to secure that. I mean, who can't respect Bernie for what he did? He had the vision, which is a hallmark of entrepreneurship, vision and passion and commitment. He had the vision back in the 70s when he took control of Brabham to actually see that the Formula One constructors were effectively at odds with each other, and there was an opportunity to seize control. And that's effectively what he did, the creation of Formula One management. Now, Bernie's also recognised that the real passion and heritage in many respects of Formula One does come from Europe. And that's not to decry New Zealand with Bruce McLaren and Denny Hulme and other great Formula One heritage that you have. But obviously it's a very Eurocentric sport because of NASCAR in the States, V8 in Australia. So Formula One was in a Eurozone, which, as we've seen now, has clearly suffered economically in recent years. So he was quick to recognise there was an opportunity to take that sport and to internationalise it and to move east, to move into the emerging developing economies. And since that time, starting with Bahrain in 2004, he's extrapolated into markets like Malaysia, Singapore, Korea, and that trend will continue. A lot of people are somewhat cynical about it. What Bernie's done is he's stretched the calendar. There's even talk of taking the series up to 22, 23 races. But again, it's indicative of how Bernie had not only the vision to get control of Formula One, and is probably the largest single owner custodian, now in conjunction with CVC, the private equity firm, of a sport anywhere in the world. Now, when CVC bought in just 5-6 years ago, they paid something like 20% of what is now perceived the value of Formula One. There's talk of Formula One being valued at over $10 billion with a pending listing likely sometime this year. So Formula One, which competes on a weekly basis with Premier League as probably the most watched sports format anywhere in the world, I think Bernie deserves credit for what he has created. The biggest issue confronting Formula One is who's going to fill his very big, small shoes going forward from this point on. And it is something which needs to be resolved. Quickly going through some other innovators and entrepreneurs in the sport. Obviously, Lalit Modi takes a lot of the credit for the creation of the IPL. In recent interviews, he said that he'd been working on it for something like 10 years, so he'd clearly been doing his research. A lot of people thought he just plagiarized the ICL and he'd knocked it off. But obviously with the BCCI, T20 has become a huge phenomenon. It's in its 5th year now, and I think for the first time ever, New Zealand's getting to watch the games live. So there's clearly a market for it. I think it'll be interesting to see how it can sustain itself, but nonetheless, a transformation in terms of the commercial application of T20, which, let's not forget, in 2003, good old England invented T20, but like most sports, we gave it to the rest of the world to exploit more successfully. Tony Fernandez, just before it came up, I had an alert. It's Tony's birthday today. So Tony Fernandez, born 30th of April, 1964, same year as me, so Chinese Year of the Dragon. Tony is unquestionably a serial entrepreneur. He was voted Asia's Entrepreneur of the Year last year. He had the foresight and the, pardon my French, balls to take on AirAsia, paid $1 for it. It's now a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and AirAsia and AirAsia X obviously have become a leading budget airline worldwide. Tony then, probably indicative of his ability to give money back, decided that he'd go into the world of Formula One, but rather than start at the top echelon, decided that he would effectively reinvigorate the old Lotus brand, which led to a major tussle, as you know, and effectively he then bought last year Caterham, another car brand, and so Tony now is a regular feature on the Formula One pit wall. I personally think he's more likely to be listening to music than what's going on in the Formula One race. But no, joking aside, I mean, he's obviously one of the major new players, and interestingly, he decided that he'd extend his portfolio with a recent £30 million purchase of Queen's Park Rangers, a club which I actually helped my friend and then owner Richard Thompson sell to Chris Wright of Chrysalis fame back in 1996, and Richard was one of my partners when we bought Leeds United. But because of the dual ownership roles, you're not allowed to own more than one club at any one time. So we managed to sell QPR for 10 and buy Leeds for 16, plus the assumption of some debt. Another innovator, I mean, I could have put Phil Knight up here, but I thought I'd take a challenger brand, and that's Kevin Plank, the founder, chairman, CEO, president of Under Armour. Now, a lot of people would have thought that with Nike and Adidas, Reebok, Puma, etc., that there wasn't a market opportunity to join, you know, such revered company and become a major brand. As you see, by hook or by crook, Kevin, who started back in 1996, his company turned over $17,000. That's for the year, by the way. Its last quarterly report, it's now tracking at about $1.5 billion in sales. So clearly, he's managed to demonstrate that through innovation and a lot of the fabrication work that he's doing, he's also managed to tie in with some challenger brands as relates to endorsements. His timing, obviously, with Welsh Rugby Union was fairly inspired, and if it wasn't for some unfortunate sendings offs and near conversions, they would have been playing the All Blacks in the final. But you probably would have preferred that, knowing that France has statistically a better record than Wales against you. But no, I mean, that deal, together with Tottenham Hotspur, who've been somewhat of a revelation after years of disappointment. Tottenham, obviously, was a deal which really put him in the big league in terms of apparel in Premiership soccer. And even someone who I myself, active in the golf world as I am, wouldn't have foreseen how successful he'd become. Hunter Mahan, who's now one of the top 5 world-ranked players in golf today. So, combination of absolute determination and also, you know, some inspired timing in terms of endorsement deals. But I think it's definitely an interesting case study, Under Armour, in its own right. Technological innovation in sport. There have been some great examples from Peter today. I'll have to check if the Zorb family are anything to do, the Akers family with me there, but I'll get onto that later. But no, in fairness, competition, be they local, regional, national, international, has been the major driver of innovation in technology. Whether it's shoes, obviously Adidas promoting with Johan Blake, the lightest ever shoe for the upcoming Olympics. Whether it's Usain Bolt with Puma, and Puma believe that the media value of Usain Bolt to them is 250 million euros a year. So I tell Ricky Sims, why are they only paying you 15 million then? But anyway, but obviously you're going to see in less than 100 days at the London Olympics examples of all types of innovation. Clearly we've had it in the swimming pool, we've had it with a number of these other sports, cycling, Formula One, obviously the technological innovation there. So that's continuing, and obviously the administrators of the game are having to keep pace with it. And I think obviously there's been a big debate about the use of technology in sport, and none more so than in football with the whole goal line technology spat that's existed between many football associations and leagues relative to FIFA and UEFA. One shouldn't forget that another first in many ways, at the time that Hawkeye was being developed, so was Virtual Eye by Ian Taylor here. And in many respects, people would say that Virtual Eye is as good, if not better, than Hawkeye. But again, timing circumstance meant that Hawkeye became the more established worldwide technology as regards the use in sports. So in summary, what are the main entrepreneurial traits that all of these people I've spoken about today have? What is innovation? What is entrepreneurialism? Some of the themes that I think are consistent are having a clear vision, definitely passion as evidenced, courage of your conviction, risk-taking. Now, I have probably just as many failures as I have successes, but on the premise that I'm always trying to back individuals or management or concepts. Sometimes the failures through lack of capital, and I know in post-GFC world, capital constraint is a major issue which is relevant to all companies. I think also from a unique perspective, the old adage of pioneers and settlers, it's sometimes not best to be first. I've often been accused of being like Martin Peters, ahead of my time in some respects, but no, I think what is encouraging is that most of these people have had some spectacular failures along the way. It's unfair. There's not one person in the world, any one of your Forbes rich list, from Carlos Slim to Warren Buffett to Bill Gates, who hasn't at some point had some major failure in their career. And it's really coming back to the States. Obviously England does suffer from the tall poppy syndrome. In America, unless you've got 2 or 3 bankruptcies under your belt, then you're probably not going to be a true entrepreneur. But in reality, I think it's knowing that at any point, and particularly in today's environment, at any point people can go literally from rags to riches, whether that's financial or whether that's more aesthetic, just through the development of their ideas. Persistence, I think, is a key one there, never giving up. I mean, Howard Schultz, who developed Starbucks, a great story, he presented the Starbucks initiative 500 occasions until he got capital. Another gentleman reading recently in Fortune magazine, the co-founder of Paul Mitchell Hair Products, John Paul Dejoria, he was a door-to-door salesman. Now, the average tenure of a door-to-door sales job is actually 3.5 days. He worked in it for 3 years. And what he said is the biggest thing he learned is understanding how to cope with rejection, particularly in door-to-door selling. As the 15th door slams in your face, knocking on door number 16, good morning. And he was selling effectively the equivalent of encyclopedias. So, tough sell. But the persistence, and interestingly, although he's known for his fortune, which probably stands at about $4 billion from Paul Mitchell Hair Products, he's actually going to make his biggest ever fortune from nothing other than tequila, or tequila, however you pronounce it. He owns 70% of the Patron brand. Now, last year, Patron sold 2.45 million cases of tequila. Now, prevailing rates, and based upon some other precedents that Bacardi and Diageo have paid for those type of companies, That business is probably worth $5–6 billion. So, there's an example of someone who, in his day, was parking his car in Rodeo Drive because he knew it was a safe area, but living out of his car. And he was lucky to have a big break because the actress Patricia Kendall, who was in 2 television series, Knots Landing and Dr. Kildare, would shop in Rodeo Drive, and one day she sort of tapped on his window and offered him a place to stay. And he effectively had his big break because whilst working and living in her villa, she would have the answer phone. And so she had this eloquent English accent and saying, "Paul is not here right now, please leave your number," etc., etc. So he was lucky enough to, as I say, have breaks in life, got into the celebrity world, which is what drove the success of Paul Mitchell. But at the same time, he's managed to take his passion, in this case tequila, and create a phenomenal global brand. So trying to bring it some relevance to what New Zealand can do to cultivate entrepreneurialism and innovation. We can't help but have idols. I think we all have sporting idols. There's, the picture of Dick Taylor there today obviously made a major impression on Michael, as it did for many people here. And given the success of the All Blacks over the years and individual and team performances, I think unquestionably sporting idols as ambassadors for schools and community. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but clearly, what will make primarily the primary school kids and secondary school kids actually engage is having celebrity peer groups that they can look up to. And I think, this is where they can play a major role. I think obviously professional clubs do an awful lot, with the leagues that they have. And maybe there should be an increase in the number of internships. Maybe there should be more active sort of engagement through that mechanism. I think also, it's a touchy subject, but forcing entrepreneurialism, innovation onto the curriculum. I know it's hard enough getting sport itself included into the curriculum, but that is something which government has to take a lead on. I know there's a funding issue because obviously teachers aren't a particularly well-paid profession, but as you've evidenced earlier today, as a volunteer nation, you're well up there in the top 5. So I think some form of curriculum exposure, using case studies that are relevant, because there are so many sporting success stories, many new ones that I didn't know until Peter alluded to them today. I think obviously the funding, I don't want to get too embroiled in that, but I think because we live in a very audio-visual world, I mean, most people are familiar with the major shows, the formats that get extrapolated worldwide, whether they're X Factor or Idol, or in this case, The Apprentice. So maybe creating something with TVNZ or Sky Television, which is on the lines of an apprentice-style approach, which is of a sporting rather than exclusively business focus. I think obviously funding is a key issue. So small business loans, enterprise investment schemes, other tax incentives to encourage people, particularly now that the cost of developing, say, apps. I mean, one of the byproducts of these devices, I mean, it's staggering, but 100 million apps are downloaded every single day. There are now something like 1.2 million apps available, 50% of them on Apple, but Google Play and Nokia and BlackBerry RIM. So the apps now is an enormous opportunity, and apps can be developed for as little as $5,000, $10,000. One of the big things that's emitting at the moment is the number of individual sporting athlete apps. We actually struggle to find many, if any. Probably the most well-known athlete in the world today, simply by dint of his Facebook following, is Cristiano Ronaldo. He has 43 million Facebook followers and 9 million Twitter followers. And he's ahead of Messi, who has about 35 million Facebook followers. But Ronaldo launched his own app in conjunction with Castrol. He does his own training techniques. There are all sorts of exclusive features involved with him. Obviously, there isn't any live Real Madrid coverage, but I think the opportunity of the sporting heroes developing their own apps would be a very good one in this market. Obviously, conferences like this, I think this is the fourth or fifth iteration of a conference like this, but maybe making this even more international. As I say, there's no reason why the world won't come to New Zealand. It's very much a sort of prerequisite for conferences and exhibitions to have major panel of leading speakers, whether it's a conference and or exhibition, a convex, and I think there's potentially scope for New Zealand, maybe to host a sport accord, or maybe to create its own equivalent sports conference and exhibition. I think on a sort of final note, one of the key things, given the success of the Rugby World Cup, is that Jacques Rogge did point out that there's absolutely no reason why New Zealand couldn't/shouldn't bid for an Olympics. Now, to put that into perspective, in 1952, Finland hosted the Summer Games and Norway hosted the Winter Games in that year. Norway repeated it in Lillehammer in 1994. So, countries with not dissimilar population bases have actually managed to take on the world's biggest sporting spectacle. Obviously, it's an excuse then for further regeneration. It's now over 20 years since Auckland hosted the Commonwealth Games in 1990, and there was talk of maybe Christchurch hosting the 2022 Commonwealth Games, and that may be no longer in the pipeline because of the Gold Coast success with 2018. But I think hosting major sporting events like that is a legitimate opportunity for New Zealand. I mean, the success of the Rugby World Cup and the 80,000 or so international visitors that experienced the hospitality and the infrastructure that you have is really world class. And I think that comes back to the humility point. I think obviously as a nation, you're very understated. And also this sense that, we're only 4.4 million people and maybe 1 million expats worldwide. In a country, or in a world, of 7 billion people, that's a very small percentage, but it doesn't mean you can't make a difference. And I would contend that on the basis that, I think Michael said every fortnight that a language disappears, we'll measure that up against the fact that every fortnight the population globally grows by the equivalent of New Zealand's. So over 100 million net new people every year is added to the world's population. That's quite staggering. But how many of those people are actually capable of making a difference? And I think the advantage that you have is obviously as a great country being able to host events. And I'm not saying that you don't, but turning to some of the areas, I mean, there's a natural hierarchy of sports. It's not all about rugby, sadly. There is a natural hierarchy of sports, and it's very difficult sometimes to force your way onto the calendar, either because there isn't the promoter prepared to do it, or there isn't the private sector sponsor to underwrite it. But when you actually look at the events that could be hosted in this country, I mean, one of the areas that I think perhaps you should look at is certainly showcasing world-class athletes and teams on an ad hoc basis. I mean, one of the things that's really been innovative in the last 10, 15 years in sports is how companies, individuals, are forcing their way onto the sporting calendar. Yes, there is a natural order in sports, and it's very difficult to find windows, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. And I think, the closed seasons for certain sports are very apposite. I mean, I think it's a shame that people like Usain Bolt and Tyson Gay and Safa Powell haven't been here, or Federer, Djokovic, Murray, Nadal haven't played in combat here. So there are lots of examples of how New Zealand is perfectly capable of hosting such caliber athletes and events, but they may have to be non-competition events. Some of the things I do is taking pop-up events into cities who know they could probably never host an Olympic Games or a Commonwealth Games or a World Cup football, but that doesn't decry them the opportunity of actually having those stars come to their country. Invariably, the infrastructure exists, or it's nominal capital investment to showcase such events, and I do strongly recommend that that's something which should be done, because it suddenly puts New Zealand in the forefront of people's minds again. If they see Usain Bolt coming here, or they see Djokovic playing here, that's going to be world news. As I mentioned, the huge social media following that these athletes have now. what about having Real or Barca or Manchester United come here? Now, yes, there's always a financial cost and implication, and governments are only prepared to do so much. But I do believe that there's a potent demand here which could be satisfied, and there's no reason why New Zealand perhaps can't be bolder. All this conservative approach maybe needs to be somewhat more aggressive. So concluding very quickly on what I do, it's very difficult because I'm literally a sort of lone wolf operator. I have a couple of people who work with me, but what I try and do is I try and create events and create opportunities. So I'm currently working on a number of sports, from major sports, including football and golf, down to minor sports such as polo and squash. And I think what I like is the spectrum of the 100 or so sports that exist worldwide, having exposure to as many of them as possible, and they all have a case. Talking to Sarah last night, she said there's over 200,000 members of the gymnastics association here in New Zealand, and I think it's important to recognise that when you marry up the participation levels with the viewing levels and the active attendance levels, it's quite informative, and it actually demonstrates that there is a market for a lot of these long tail or bottom of the pyramid sports, and actually economics will allow many of those sports now to actually create commercial viable businesses, and I do think a lot of the suggestions here today and that hopefully over the course of the next 2 days we'll talk about can be funded or should be funded. So I think that concludes today's. Obviously tomorrow I'm going to be talking more about digital sports and media. Okay, thank you.